Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay, very good. I'm actually having a pretty bad cold today, so I want to warn you, I may start coughing, so forgive me, please. It's kind of ironic that I gave this lecture the title Staying Sober, when in fact I'm completely dosed up with, a sort of toxic mix of aspirin and Dayquil, and Nate gave me some other cough medicine here just before the lecture. So if I start sounding delusional or nonsensical, it's because of the drugs, not because of me. This year actually explains why I have a cold. It's still winter in Wisconsin, and this is a photo I took yesterday morning before I went to the airport of one of our construction sites. And I think my body just quit afterwards and said, like, enough of this winter. So for me being here in Dallas, even with the hail that's supposed to come here tonight, this is a real summer treat. So thanks for having me. Anyway, I want to quickly explain the title, Staying Sober, because it is, of course, meant slightly polemic, but it's also a bit defensive. Now, I say defensive because our work tends to be formally very restrained and almost old-fashionedly disciplined, and as such may actually appear somewhat anachronistic within the larger trajectory of contemporary architecture, which I would argue is increasingly addicted to wild and often empty formalist experiments of a sort of new kind, because we are now able to build things that 50 years ago or so were only sketches, wild sketches on trace paper. But let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When you Google new skyscrapers, this is what comes up. I don't know if you can see this from where you sit, but not one of these buildings is just a sort of straight up rectangular volume that you would expect as a result from the rational extrusion of a simple floor plate, right? Which is sort of like the history of the skyscraper. Instead, each one of them is twisted, and think about that for a moment, right? I don't want to pontificate, but I think these buildings are indicative of our current cultural climate. We are sort of bored out of our minds and have a voracious appetite for constant entertainment, and as you all know, architects are eager to please. And so we start warping and bending and twisting our buildings, and they start looking like the guy here at the top, right? And sobriety sucks is perhaps fitting for a profession that is going sort of topsy-turvy in a desperate attempt to stay relevant in a world that has a very short attention span. And I think what's missing is a sort of, almost deference by architects to what surrounds us, a willingness to listen to what exists and to find an architecture not driven by this sort of weird professional competition to see who of us can scream louder, but something more quiet and more profound. Which brings me to my next point. What bothers me even more than the fact that these buildings are pretty much identical clones of each other, or that they all defy any structural or even fiscal rationality for the sake of grabbing attention and being iconic and making a statement. What actually bothers me more than this is that these buildings are scattered all around the world, right? No matter where you go, it's basically the same, and this is something that I find actually pretty disturbing. And of course, this total disregard or maybe even disrespect for the particularities of a place is happening at all architectural scales. We are now working in my office on larger scale commercial projects as well, but our first decade in existence, we started 2003, focused pretty much on residential architecture, not by choice necessarily, but that's just what you do when you sort of start an office and are not well connected, and you're sort of taking on small jobs that people think you can handle. And Nate actually asked me to focus this presentation tonight on our houses, so let's go there. Take a moment and look at these 6 images of residential architecture in the United States and try to tell me where they are. I bet you can't, right? Think about it, right? How can it be that a so-called custom house in California looks the same as one in Missouri. So I think the real question here is what makes a building site-specific, what makes a building contextual, and it's something that my partner, Brian Johnsen, and I have been interested in and trying working to resolve to some degree since we started our office 16 years ago. The question, can you design a contemporary building that conveys a sense of belonging, belonging to the site and a sense of history without succumbing to this sort of ridiculous literal mimicry or falling into the trap of stylistic preconceptions, which usually make buildings pretty bad. So our approach is a bit different from Kenneth Frampton's concept of critical regionalism, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Critical regionalism arguably looks at context through a geographically pretty broad lens, right? But we are more interested in sort of like the subtle qualities and maybe even idiosyncrasies at the scale of a particular site. It's something that helps us to develop an architectural narrative, that informs our design process in a quiet and meaningful and site-specific way. And tonight I want to show not only pictures of finished projects, but also talk about what inspires us and what guides our creative process when we design our buildings. What you see here is our first commission, which we called the Camouflage House. Maybe not so subtle name to describe our conceptual objective here, to make the house assimilate with the landscape and almost disappear in it. We started the design process by documenting colors and textures of the ever-changing foliage of the site, and then transformed them into a compositional palette and template for the building skin. We collected leaves at the site and used them to build facade study models to start testing the overall aesthetic effects you could achieve, and sort of like the idea that you could create a veil for the building that would make it disappear in the context. And you can see here, how these early abstract studies sort of ultimately guided the overall appearance of the building itself, and informed the facade components. You can see we worked with sort of weathering cedar here that is juxtaposed with these wood veneer panels, stained at different colors. Anyway, this project is almost 12 years. Actually, it's probably 13 years old now. And I don't want to dwell too long for it. We sort of have talked a lot about this building over the years, and getting bored talking about the same project. But the design process that guided us through this project established a framework, if you will, for how we approach a project, and it really became a roadmap that we are still using to this day. One lesson that we learned was the importance of physical analog models at all scales, from highly conceptual artifacts to rip and tear study models. You can see here some examples for that particular project, and then all the way to detailed section models and full-scale mock-ups. And we found model making to be also an invaluable tool to communicate with our clients, to give them something that sort of is haptic and chronicles our assumptions during the design process and what led us to proposing a certain design. And so models are really everywhere in our office. Our individual workstations, we are 8 people in my office. Each one has a model building station next to it, so there's usually always somebody in the office that's working on some 3-dimensional object. The second thing we discovered was the value of architectural diagrams. Diagrams not only to clarify and refine our own design strategies internally, between my partner and I, and then, subsequently with people that worked with us, but also to facilitate a more focused discussion with our client about the main ideas driving our design, to sort of keep them abreast of what our thought process is, so it's not just overwhelming them with like pretty images that look awkward to them. So let me go through some of our projects to demonstrate how we use models and diagrams as generators for ideas and sort of how the process unfolded in some of these projects. For the Topo House, we wanted to explore how a building might merge with the land it occupies, rather than just sitting on it as a self-referential object, right? The site is located in Wisconsin's so-called driftless region, which is an unglaciated area with softly rolling hills that alternate with tight ravines. And one of our first context models interpreted the distinct experience of moving through this landscape as a series of parallel folding planes. You can see that here on the right. And we took that model and simplified it into a continuous plane that would sort of, peel itself out from the ground, sort of creating formally something like that. And we took that idea and went through a series of rough study models, just really cardboard cut with a knife that explored possible building forms that could accommodate the given program without getting too hung up on sort of like the particularities and exact room sizes of the specific program details. And at some point, after discarding the more complex forms, we narrowed it down to a volume that was organized as 2 staggered bars. These 2 bars form sort of like a low-slung roof form that sort of extends the grade, over to a lower portion of the house and then slowly rises up until it terminates in a long cantilever at the south-facing end of the building. The diagrams here at the bottom show sort of like the volumetric morphology. We put the program together as one compact block and then started moving them around laterally in terms of pieces of the program following the topography of the land. And then we carved out spaces that became sort of like these sheltered outdoor courtyards. And then, we designed that roof band that basically ties these different blocks together again, and then added a green carpet. That's the thing that sort of extends the green prairie land over parts of the house. The floor plan is really simple. There's like basically one central spine here that ties together these 4 parts, if you will, of the house. You come in through this entry courtyard here into a vestibule, and there's a private bedroom here, another bedroom there, and then there's a main living hall there, facing south with the big overhang. That's the dashed line here you can see at the end of the building. And section model here, you can kind of see the different floor elevations in relation to another on one half of the house. And then so when you approach the house, you see the building literally merging, right here with the grade at one end, and then slowly sort of, peeling away from the ground and turning into the roof plane here that eventually rises further up to the big overhang. And this is a view standing on the lower green roof looking south. And you can see on the left where the copper roof plane starts sloping up, and then we have this little observatory sort of popping through the roof plane. And a view during the winter from the east. And then, so I talked about these voids that we created within the building form. This is that entry courtyard I was talking about. So you come to the front door. This is the front door here. This is seen at night. It's a 10-foot wide pivot glass door that opens into that little vestibule here. And then you can see here the first steps that sort of lead up to the next, level up, if you will. I mean, it's not a full level, but like 4 steps or so up to the next floor plate plateau, and then it starts rising up from there further. And here you are in the kitchen. You can see how those steps or some other steps here come down to a lower part. And then when you turn around, you see into the living hall and out into the snowy landscape, as always. This is here not during the winter. So this is the south-facing patio with a big overhang here. And then this picture here captures the views from the observatory into the beautiful landscape around it. There's a state park very close by, and part of the way we designed this building was there's a big sort of observatory tower on a hill in the state park that overlooks the side, and it was important for us that that house would basically not just sit there as like sort of like this sore thumb sticking out, but something that when you look down toward the valley where you see the house, that the roof of the house really became sort of like something like a facade system, or facade of the building, with that green carpet sort of lapping over it. The material palette is basically limited to cast-in-place concrete, copper, and then integrally colored fiber concrete panels. And these panels, you can kind of see that here, are separated by thin metal fins, which we designed as a series of interrelated and expanding and contracting shapes, shown here in a couple of study models. The idea traces back to an observation we made, and that's not really rocket science as an observation, so don't get me wrong, but we sort of consciously realized the beauty of these, the sort of prairie grasses, and they're changing nature, right? Like at one point, this looks like a perfectly level plain until the wind picks up, and there are pretty strong winds in the area, and the landscape starts to deform a little bit, right? And we wanted to capture that in the facade system, so we designed a series of 190 sort of interrelated, individually shaped aluminum fins that were cut by water jet. And I think you can kind of see here that visual distortion that the fins create. So in effect, the appearance of the house constantly changes depending on the angle from which you approach it. And in a sense, the fins subvert and destabilize the geometric purity of the building volume itself, which creates a sort of formal tension which we really enjoy. And I think you will see that kind of tension reappear in various iterations in some of the other work I'm going to show. The next project, the Pleated House, is a small building for a couple who moved back to Door County in Wisconsin after spending the last few decades in Boston. And Door County is a peninsula at the northern tip of the state and surrounded by three lakes, by three sides, on three sides, right, there we go, by Lake Michigan. And the property is on the west side of the peninsula. It's sort of on a hilly, in a hilly forest. Here's the shoreline. There's actually a row of houses here, but it's at the level of the beach, and then the land rises up, and we are sort of like at the top of that. We tried to design a structure that would appear as this really low and sort of somber volume sitting quietly in a small clearing, and really trying to not draw attention to it, and you cannot see it from the street. In fact, even when you go on this private road, it takes you a while to actually detect where the building sits. And the building is really a simple one-story podium with a little box on top of that. And as you move around the building, you experience the building is something that sort of feels, comfortably nestled in the context. And when we started working on this, one thing that really sparked our interest was bark. Whether you look at the tree trunk from afar, it usually looks like a simple cylindrical extrusion of its diameter, but when you zoom in, you realize the complexity and sort of visual depth that bark has, and it's really sort of, when you look at it closely, it's a highly textured and undulating skin, almost like a pleated curtain that wraps around the trunk, if you will, and it creates a densely animated surface of valleys and peaks that cast deep shadows onto itself. So we were wondering how we could translate this effect with the architecture of the building itself, with a goal to make the building more less defined in the sense that it separates inside and outside. Have a more amorphous exterior. So we started with a piece of bark and mapped its folding structure, which resulted in a sort of random but beautiful line. And that line sort of oscillates between these inner and outermost points, right? And this figure became a conceptual template for possible building skins, trying to, again, adopt a similar texture. I guess what we were interested in was a way to achieve a more unstable building perimeter that sort of softens that, usually abrupt clash between exterior and interior, between really nature and wall. So anyway, when you look at the top here, this is sort of like a plan view of a conventional facade system. These black lines here represent the four corners of a sort of a conventional house, and the orange line is the sort of planar or flattened projection of all four sides of the house, right? What you basically get is one continuous linear band, and then if you fold it up, it becomes the walls of the house. The diagram here at the bottom shows the same sort of planar projection, but shows what we are actually doing in this particular house, where we work with a series of slightly angled walls that create a sort of meandering veil, not unlike the bark that I had mentioned before. So the building skin wraps around the house as this gently folding plane of charred cedar boards, and you can see how it sort of reads against the top and bottom metal angles that are straight, so you have some datum line against which you can read the undulation. We emphasize the entry for the house here by pulling or angling one of the walls in, so creating a little entry forecourt with a forced perspective toward the entry door. The plan, by the way, is again very simple. It's just a little vestibule here and an open living hall, and then you go up a set of stairs into a bedroom suite that is embedded within the green roof of the podium of the house. This is the view of that entry condition. The one side here folds in. The other one we sort of exposed is the wrong word, but we played with the idea of exposure of something else. So the skin of the building sort of ends here, and we designed a sort of a highly articulated wall of milled and varnished cedar blocks, which we stacked at slight angles to echo the undulation of the charred wrapper, but at much tighter intervals and obviously in a sort of horizontal way. So this wall actually leads to the entry door and then pierces through the building wall. You can kind of see it continues on the inside, and then as you walk through there, it actually leads you all the way to the other side of the house with access to a long linear patio along the edge of the woods. This is a view of the patio here, and you see this long retaining wall here that sort of double functions as a bench. There's a light fixture built in on the underside of this concrete top that emits a nice soft glow at night. And a view back at the house in the evening here, you can see the light washing the patio. Now we have a set of 24-foot wide sliding doors. This is an enormous opening. It's really cool hardware, very easy to use, and it connects the house, the main space of the house, obviously very generously with that back patio. The living space itself is actually pretty small, but the large doors, allow for expansive views out and obviously sort of extend that living space to the outside and make it feel much more generous, spatially generous than it looks. And then the other side of the living hall is anchored by this, delicate white lacquered steel case that then leads up into that bedroom suite upstairs, which you can see here. Back in Milwaukee, we worked on a project that was named after the spectral wavelength of the color green, which is 510 nanometers. The site is located in a post-war suburb and cradled by really mature trees all the way around. There was a house there that was in total disrepair and was torn down to be replaced by this building here. We organized the program in two interlocking bars. There's a service bar here that was clad in a whitewashed wood, and then a concrete block ribbon that sort of interlocks with that and cradles the main living hall of the house as sort of the social epicenter. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but that L-shaped configuration allowed us to have a more sort of public forecourt here and then a private backyard there. So that activity hub I was talking about is really like one open space where the owners cook and dine and lounge together. They are sort of holding fundraising events quite frequently, so that needed to be a pretty generously sized space. And we wanted to mark that social epicenter of the house with these perimeter wall panels here. We used the shades of green to obviously to contrast it with the rest of the sort of muted colors of the house. But it creates this, almost like this piano nobile, if you will, colorful volume that's bracketed top and bottom within that white concrete block form, which folds up and then creates a sort of observatory here as well on the third floor. Now, why green? In our discussions with the client, it became clear that one thing that they really regretted about living in Wisconsin was the short duration of the summer. So we proposed to use color as an architectural device to infuse the interior year-round with the lush tones of summer's, verdant but short-lived greenery. And we used this diagram here to illustrate the idea. As Wisconsin's long winter sets in, the lush green turns into gray. This is where we are right now, still. Until we, artificially reintroduce green to the color palette, sort of like an abstract and maybe cheerful echo, of nature's chromatic vibrancy. So the idea was that this splash of color would act as a potent antidote against the effects of those long, protracted winter months when the actual apertures of the house frame nothing but, the sort of somber views into Wisconsin's frozen landscape. So the green perimeter wall that you see here from the outside also extends to the inside and really repeats the colors as floor-to-ceiling wall panels that alternate with the windows. This is here the sort of open living and dining space. And then there's a staircase here that leads up to the small study above on the third floor. And that study opens up to a green roof here, which you can tell does not have any railings. So by code, it's not supposed to be used, but the doc sort of discovered it as its, most desirable space in the house. So it has become occupied, and we just hope that nothing will ever happen. But it was funny because at the photo shoot here, we were around, and the photographer sort of attracted the dog, which started sort of running toward the photographer who was standing on the garage. And there was a moment where it seemed the dog would just sort of fly off the roof. But it didn't happen. They're smarter than we think. And there's a view from the backyard here. This is the master suite, and then you can see here that sort of sunken courtyard with a little fireplace here. This is where guests can sleep, and a view from the master bedroom back to the house, with a little private terrace there. Sometimes projects can be inspired by nothing more than a random encounter at a site visit, which is what happened when we designed a small studio for a country music composer, also in Wisconsin. We came across this old manure spreader that was left behind on an abandoned field across the street from our site. I'm not sure if it was the complementary colors or just the image of this sort of lonely, weathered object or artifact sort of sitting alone in the as a sort of memento of the area's agricultural past. But something sort of intrigued us really about that, and it intuitively seemed like an interesting and sort of fitting precedent for this kind of project. This sort of primitive building in the middle of the countryside. So we developed a very simple building volume that consisted of three basic components, like a concrete base, the open studio piece itself, and then a steel shroud that sort of laps over that studio space. The concrete podium sort of carves into the slope of the site, and then formally supports that studio space above, and then the long sides of that studio space are covered by the steel shroud that folds over the top, right? And you know, the rusted manure spreader had served as a starting point, and maybe a little bit too literal, but so be it. You know, that sort of idea of weathered steel plate was an obvious and appropriate material to start talking about an enclosure system here. Weathered steel it was, but we were unhappy with the flatness and regularity of the patina of the mock-up panels that we had fabricated. And we were instead looking for the steel to emulate what we were trying to show here in this diagram here, where we juxtaposed the graphic transcription of musical sound waves with the sort of rigorous vertical lines of a steady metronome. And so instead of cleaning the Core 10 before installing it, which is sort of best practices, right, we did decide to keep all the alloy imperfections and surface oils and roller marks from the steel mill untreated to create a sort of, you know, really sort of unpredictable and ever-changing veneer that would contrast with the modularity, right, of the cladding and the formal rigor of the building itself. And this is a close-up view here of the facade panels here, and the concrete base and that shroud that wraps around the building, or well, two sides of the building, is separated by they are separated by this clear story. So we basically have a polycarbonate glazing wrapping around where the floor trusses are, which brings natural light into this storage podium below, but also at night when the lights are turned on in that storage base, you know, that the building has this nice continuous clear story that sort of ominously glows in the forest. The studio itself is a totally austere space, you know, just an empty room to, you know, relax and compose, contemplate, with glass doors here to get in, and then glass doors to get on top of the green roof here. That's the green roof over the garage plinth. Again, no railing. Must have forgotten that. You know, the thing about this project is that it's sort of utilitarian and raw, but very clear about what it does. And in that sense, I think it follows really the tradition of Midwestern pastoral architecture quite faithfully, you know, the legacy of aesthetic simplicity. And I think this is why this building, at least to us, you know, looks like something that belongs to the site, almost like it's always been there. When we talk about context as a springboard for our design process, I think it's important to know that I don't think it doesn't necessarily have to refer to physical features or attributes of a site. You know, sometimes it's a site can be sort of generic enough that you can look at other things that can inspire the design. In this case, for example, we used building typology to articulate something that we felt is site relevant. One example is a pair of cabins here that I want to show, the stacked cabin and the linear cabin, in which we both revisited the traditional typology of Wisconsin cabin compounds, which usually consist of a sort of a open plan longhouse that you know houses the communal living spaces, and then an outhouse and a freestanding tool shed. And for the stacked cabin, we tried to take those components that are usually horizontally organized and stack them vertically which allowed us to minimize the building's footprint and take advantage of the sloped side and the views into the treetops that a higher vantage would afford. So that's the stacked cabin, really simple building. And the linear cabin was designed a few years after that. In this project, we tried to express the program pieces as 3 seemingly autonomous volumes. You know, we started out with a compact mass for the entire program, like in some previous projects, and then sort of pulled pieces apart, you know, again with a storage component and a living component, and the sleeping component, like sort of like the hearth room component and the sleeping component, pulled apart and then unified by a roof plane. So the building appears as a simple bar building when you approach it from the gravel drive that weaves through the forest, and then you look through the voids to the landscape on the other side of the building. So there are 2 voids. One is this one here, which is really a covered outdoor space that you can use for barbecuing, et cetera, but also to park a car if necessary when the weather is bad. This is the tool shed, but also storage for a canoe and some outdoor equipment. And then the other void in the building is this, you know, that's basically a glass enclosure on 2 sides of that hearth room. There's a galley kitchen here, and then a wood-burning stove in the middle, a little dining space. And then you have access to the 2 sleeping quarters on either side, very small bedrooms. One is a bunk bed room, and the other one is for the parents. And we cladded that in knotty pine to sort of create a level of rusticity that, again, sort of, you know, contrasts with the clarity of the form itself. Anyway, of course, you know, context is not always pristine and awe-inspiring nature. So I wanted to show this project, which we called the Redaction House, because the surrounding here was much less accommodating than sort of bucolic and pristine settings that I've shown so far. The building sits on a tight sliver of land in the Milwaukee suburbs. It's really part of a necklace of decidedly prosaic suburban spec homes that sort of crowd the shoreline. You can kind of see the tight fit here. The site offered one small view corridor of the lake, right, around here. But as you looked sideways or turned around, you would be sort of overwhelmed by the, you know, sort of prototypical and uninspired built-up context of suburbia. So in a way, this project became an exercise in context avoidance, if you will. And it compelled us to design an introvert building that could basically function as an optic filter that would frame the desirable views and block those out that were not that desirable. The idea of introversion affected the formal evolution of this house, which is based on a series of simple volumetric reductions, and then, you know, the bottom row shows subsequent additions to the volume, which led to a sort of fragmented cube with spatial voids that organize the program inside and sort of aid us in that reductionary, whatever the word is, process. I made that up, right? That sometimes works, but anyway, we basically ended up with a big volume that interlocks with a wood cube. And we're looking here at the side of the building. You can see that this brick volume here extends beyond the actual footprint of the house, which sort of stops here and transforms into a perforated garden wall that encloses and really screens a small entry courtyard. This is what you see from the street. In the foreground, you can see here the garage that's part of that plinth extending, and then here's that perforated garden wall with a little gap in between here that marks the threshold into the sort of private space of the house, even though it is outside. So the courtyard leads into, or that entry leads into this little courtyard here. You can see on the side that perforated wall. The openings of the perforation change. So they are they are solid here, and they start being small perforations that increase in size. And I'm actually explaining this backwards. So the openings are really big when you walk in, and you know, as you sort of walk toward the front entry door, these openings close, and they sort of, you know, they start that process of blocking out the views of the neighbors, you know, and you're sort of gradually losing visual contact with the surrounding buildings. And a view back of that courtyard, you can kind of see here the changing size of these openings toward the entry of the courtyard. Now, the process of visual redaction continues on the inside. As I mentioned, the site is tightly sandwiched between two houses, which makes it rather difficult to enjoy that one narrow view of the lake, right? You know, given the sort of overwhelming presence of these not so nice homes. When we were looking at possible strategies for how to edit this difficult visual panorama, you know, one thing that came to mind was how classified documents get censored, you know, like when the CIA or Attorney General William Barr redact problematic portions of a report, and leaving, you know, those inoffensive parts legible, right? So for us, this meant conceptually to take the existing context, and no, this slide is unfortunate. That's, you know, this slide is supposed to show white blocks here. That's sort of, it's the worst thing when you have to explain what a slide should show. There's somehow an editing mistake here made by somebody, I don't know who. Anyway, this is it's a pretty cool graphic because, you know, you would see these white blocks of blocking this out, creating a pattern not unlike what you're seeing here, which, you know, so basically informed or started the design process for facades, for compositional palette for that part of the house. That's really unfortunate. It's sort of like a highlight of the whole lecture. And anyway, this is what you see when you step from the entry court through the front door into the building. Basically open living hall here. And you can see the staggered apertures in the back, right, in the sitting area there, and here as we were looking into the space from the second story. And you can see the interplay of solid voids and of solids and solid walls and voids, and you know, how these apertures sort of carefully frame views that avoid seeing that non-desirable context around. All right, so the next project is one that we just recently completed. I wanted to just, this is still a residential project, but I want to change the scale just a little bit. It's a 6-unit residential development designed for a vacant urban lot in Oak Park in Sacramento, California. This was a spec development, and we had to work with very tight margins, so the design had to be extremely efficient and simple. We organized the units as a compact cluster of 6 individual 2-story homes that mirror the massing and scale of the area's existing building stock around. Each building is articulated as a plinth with a complementary volume that sort of starts at the back and then wraps over and cantilevers over the front to create like sort of like a sheltered entry condition. And we realized really early on that the cantilever and the facade of that, the visible face of that cantilever was really going to be the principal facade for each of these buildings, because budget was tight and we knew that we had to sort of allocate our resources very carefully. But let me take a step back. Like so many other urban neighborhoods in cities around America, Oak Park for decades experienced the effects of urban flight and economic disinvestment. And only in recent years has been rediscovered by students and young professionals and artists as an affordable community close to downtown Sacramento. And I know that sounds like just the classic gentrification process, but it's a little more subtle there. a little more honest in a way. And I think it hasn't really created sort of like an influx of, high luxury condos, but it is happening at a sort of moderate level, and it is good for the community. It's very diverse, both economically and racially, and the idea or the effect of people moving back to the neighborhoods, of redeveloping even existing homes, is quite healthy there. Anyway, with the influx of new people came, small art galleries, independent coffee shops, family businesses that are now starting to fill abandoned storefronts, and so on and so forth. And then there's a whole scene of large-scale murals that have transformed over the years. Drab warehouses, some of them vacant, transforming them into multicolored canvases, and old houses in the neighborhood being repainted in bright colors. This intrigued us right away, and so it happened that color became here an obsession. And you will see, not in or maybe with some of these projects I'm showing here, but when you look at some of our other work on our website, color has become an important element in our design process, because we feel it is an easy tool, or an easy application to create a reference to a site, and is also very cost effective. And so we have now studied color theory quite a bit to see how we can apply some of these rules into our own design. But anyway, when we first visited the site, we sort of drew a color-coded map of the surrounding buildings. And we made this large collage here in which we paired pictures of surrounding homes with vertical color bars that we felt best complemented the respective paint schemes of the buildings. And these vertical bars, actually reminded us of color pencils in a box, right? Which in turn became the inspiration for the main and defining element of the homes, that south-facing facade of the cantilever. So when we took these pencils and spaced them out a little bit, we realized that it really sort of started looking like a template for something like a screen wall, right? Basically a series of vertical facade louvers that together could serve as a brise-soleil and also give the building an immediate recognizable identity. And this is exactly what we ended up doing. The front facade here of that cantilever basically frames an infill of colored aluminum louvers with prismatic colors that juxtapose the home's otherwise sort of muted and straightforward material palette. Here's a view in the evening, and you can see how the buildings turn into a sort of playful addition along the street. And a view during the day. Close-up view of the facade louvers. It was actually interesting. We detailed this completely different, and it became a cost issue, as so much, good ideas seem to cost money. But we were actually fortunate enough. There is still a car repair shop a block away, and they actually ended up fabricating these. They bent sheet metal and painted these in their paint shop on the site, and did it for a fraction of the way we originally had detailed these as sort of extruded aluminum, custom profiles. There's a daydreaming. All right, I know that I'm in 50 minutes in here, and I know that Nate is going to kill me if I run late here. So there's one more project I'm going to show, and I'll let you go. And I want to conclude with this project because it is about beer. I know it doesn't really work with the title of my lecture or my status of being a drugged up architect, but I'm German, and Milwaukee is very German-based, as German has a history of German immigrants, and beer is obviously sort of like the beer made Milwaukee. And funny enough, is our office in Milwaukee is based in a former Schlitz Tavern. They're called tight houses. They used to be like on every other block in Milwaukee. That's a beautiful brick, so a Richardsonian brick building, 2-story building, with incredible detailing, from the turn of the century, so we our DNA is sort of tied with beer, and actually one of our first commissions was the design of the interiors of the main lobby for a residential project within the old walls of the former Blatz Brewery in downtown Milwaukee. And I'm not going to show actually a lot of this here, but the main element of our design was a series of monumental pivoting wall panels that were made from 1,590 beer bottles each. And the wall panels can sort of rotate 90 degrees and open a club room up to the main lobby, and conversely can close and become sort of like this color filter that with this so beautiful amber light washing the space. But that project too was 10 or 12 years ago, and then there was a whole decade without any beer-related work for us. So we just drank it in the meantime. Until last year when Pabst, the third of the grand old and now defunct legacy breweries in Milwaukee, approached us. Pabst doesn't exist anymore, but there's an organization that runs the historic Pabst Mansion House Museum, which is a fantastic 60-room villa that Frederick Pabst, the sort of founder of Pabst Brewing, built for himself in the early 1890s. And that organization asked us to design the visitor center and archives for the museum. The Pabst Mansion is, by the way, one of the most frequented house museums in North America. And if you're ever in Milwaukee, not only stop by our office, but you should really go there, because it is, if you have any interest in architecture, this is an incredible building. In today's dollars, it costs $60 million to build. Maybe that's not a lot in Dallas today with the oil money, but it's a lot of money in sort of the confines of Wisconsin. Okay, just a little side topic here. One thing that amazed us when we started our research for the project was this. The sale of beer could actually yield enough money, for someone to build himself a castle-like building, at the scale that only nobility would have been able to afford in 19th century Europe, right? Which is the time this was built. And we actually looked at the overall profit of the Pabst Brewing Company in 1890 to calculate how much profit they made per bottle, which was 0.27 cents. That is calculated by using the volume, the overall volume that they brewed, and then sort of dividing it by the content of one bottle, right? Because a lot of the beer was, of course, tapped in buildings like the tight house that our office is in. And then we researched the average cost of one brick during the same time and calculated it took the equivalent of selling 12 bottles of beer to pay for one brick, which is 3.25 cents. And when you look at the mansion and those gigantic solid walls of brick, you can only imagine the sort of amount of beer that must have been consumed to finance that place. This all has nothing to do with the project, by the way. I just thought I would share that with you, because we spent a lot of time on the math, if you can imagine. Anyway, this is the mansion, and it used to be part of a necklace of grand mansions built by the industrial captains of the time. This is actually a Wisconsin Avenue now. It was called Grand Avenue and goes all the way to the lake through downtown. This is really the only mansion left. It was going to be destroyed in 1970, but then was bought by the organization to save it. Marquette University is right around here. You can kind of see, just like the Noli plan of the area shows these, really sort of solid footprints of the buildings encroaching on this now it looks tiny, right? It was still big, Pabst mentioned. But the funny thing is, the site did not really provide enough space for that visitor center, without sort of encroaching on the view of the building itself. So the organization bought this lot here across the street. But it's not only not on the side, it's also not right across the street. It's sort of like on an angle. And I think one of the struggles we had was to figure out a way how these two buildings could actually relate so people would understand to go to this building and then start their tour here, and then their guide would walk them over to the mansion. Our response was, this is sort of a view from the back of the mansion here, and then the proposed visitor center over there. And you can see the sort of this piece here that's rotated out of this very simple box building, which angles directly toward the mansion, and we called that a viewfinder to sort of explain the idea. That's the viewfinder here as a sort of like prominent feature that you see from the street, but then also it's sort of dominating the interior space, something that sort of directs your views across the street toward the mansion. And then, this is a building that has not a tremendous budget, so here too, we had to work efficiently in plan. So this is really just basically a square building with one wall that sort of angles toward the entry vestibule here and leads you into an open space that can be used for visitors to congregate before their tour starts, but also for events like weddings and so on and so forth. And then there's a little store here. Actually, these are all going to be fixtures that can be moved out to make a larger event space, and a little exhibit space over here, offices and back of house stuff there. And then there's actually a whole classroom cluster in the basement. But the basement is mainly occupied by by the archives, which you can see from the main level by looking into this atrium down, and you will see there, the archivists working through their materials and sorting things and so on. Again, just the massing, very simple here. You see here that angled wall that sort of opens up the entry and a view from the street, from across the street. This is all going to be clad in polycarbonate glazing, triple wall system that actually has a very good R value compared to glass. And then, sort of complemented by these very tall vertical fins that give the building a sense of monumentality that we feel befits sort of like its purpose in relationship and dialogue with that sort of grand monumental mansion across the street. And so you will enter along this terracotta colored textured concrete wall that leads to the main door, and this really became sort of like the one element where we try to find where we're trying to integrate some clue to its relationship, architectural relationship with the mansion across the street. And we wanted to avoid any kind of historicism, but we thought it would be interesting and appropriate to work into the building some, decorative element borrowed from the mansion, something that would inherently feel familiar to the visitors of the mansion without being literal about it. So we cataloged the patterns of terracotta and carved wood and carved stone around the mansion to find something that we could use, sort of like as a template for formwork for the concrete entry wall. And we ended up selecting a stone column at the mansion's portico, which we mapped with the help of digital stereophotogrammetry, which is really sort of fascinating because you go around, basically take photos, and then there's this pretty sophisticated software stitches it together and builds automatically a three-dimensional model of the pattern that you can work off of and use for fabrication as well. So, we stole a selected piece of pattern at the mansion, and then sort of idealized it into something that sort of worked with the scale of our wall panels. And then we added vertical grooves into the formwork to create an additional textural layer that sort of would enhance the tactile qualities of this wall. And then we randomly filled some of these reveals in with metal rods that would, further animate the plane. And here's a view of the 3D printed model of the wall. You can see how the reading of the pattern really changes, under different light conditions, and really, again, the angle from which you approach it. In addition to the open space for the visitors, the building also had to accommodate the archives I mentioned before, and the collection is quite astounding. They not only have the full corporate files of the Pabst Brewing Company, but just a random array of artifacts and things and advertisements that relate to the brewing company. And all this really reminded us of these Renaissance depictions of those famous cabinets of curiosities, those wild encyclopedic collections of random stuff. And our goal was to keep some of that creative chaos that we really liked in the existing warehouse where they work out of right now, and make it visible to the visitors of the new building. But obviously presenting it in a more rational, more orderly framework. So we designed a wooden ceiling band that runs from the gift shop, which is sort of over here, and overhead to that atrium. You see here the archivist working, looking down, and then creating this really sort of modular shelving system, or really a version of a cabinet of curiosities in which random artifacts can be placed. Beer steins, busts of Frederick Pabst, old bottles, company artifacts. And I know I'm at an hour now, so I'll wrap up with this last slide. Maybe a good segue into the happy hour that Nate was, but stay sober, right? But thank you anyway. Happy to take questions. I don't know if you have time left or not. Okay, yeah. No questions. Everybody's thirsty. Yeah. All right.